We're about ready to go, so I want to welcome you all. Thank you all for coming out on this not entirely inappropriately cold afternoon for the final talk in this semester's Contemporary History Institute Speaker Series. December 7, as it were, has been living in infamy as a date for 76 years now, so it seemed somewhat appropriate to go with a World War II themed talk on on Pearl Harbor Day, although it's obviously a different front. My name's Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm the director of CHI. And for those of you new to our events, we're a multidisciplinary institute that joins the perspectives of history, economics, political science, and journalism in an effort to make sense of the questions that define our time. My predecessor in this very job is the man I'm going to introduce here. This great pleasure to introduce Steve Miner, and I think actually in some ways this is an exercise in futility, since I'm sure almost all of you know him well. So I could tell you about his degrees from King's College or from Rice or from Indiana University, where he earned his PhD in history. But mostly I'm in a bind here because I recall pretty clearly Steve introducing Lon Hamby about 3 years ago, was it? 2 years ago, with all kinds of well-deserved praise, and that leaves me in the position of now essentially moving onto the thin ice of plagiarizing our speaker. Still, I think that the attributes that Steve stressed about Lon could be deployed here, too, about Steve. This is about citizenship in the college and university, about decades-long service, department, the college, the university. And I think, at least from my perspective, a kind of a mentorship for young faculty like myself who've come in here in the past years and decades. Of course, also, as the director of CHI in the 10-year period most recent, Steve's been essential in kind of fostering the scholarship and engagement that has brought so many of our grad students to campus and allowed them to thrive, and has deepened, I think, our sense of community as a faculty as well. Now that I've been in this job for about half a year or so, it's almost amazing to me that I can, congratulate Steve on finishing his third book. It's kind of hard to see for me how that's possible. So maybe there's hope. This book, of course, is The Furies Unleashed, The Soviet Peoples at War, 1941 to 45, which is now with the publishers. In earlier books, Steve made his mark. For example, his first book, Between Churchill and Stalin, The Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the Origins of the Grand Alliance, won the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize. As he tells it, either because the AHA leadership had good sense of humor or a certain degree of absent-mindedness, that was handed to him in an envelope labeled beer money. In between, some almost 15 years ago, Steve published Stalin's Holy War, Religion, Nationalism, and Alliance Politics, and in addition, he's published articles and book chapters, as well as a co-edited volume on failed states and fragile societies that was built on the Baker Keys conference right in this room, I believe, or in the room next door, perhaps. So this afternoon, Steve Miner will speak for a little over 45 minutes about a pretty big war, about the ways in which the Soviet state and peoples fought, sometimes one another, most of the time also the Germans. I think, again, that today's infamous date makes this a particularly apt day to talk about the Second World War. I just want to say, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and drew the U.S. into the conflict, Soviet armies had just launched their winter offensive outside Moscow, what the Germans anyway called the Eastern Front. Following this talk, we'll have our usual Q&A. And I want to finally end with a quick advertisement that our next talk, next semester, will be on January 18, the Thursday of the first week. It'll also feature a book talk by an Ohio faculty, Nuket Sandal, Political Science. So with that, I hope you will join me in thanking Steve Miner for all that he's done for Ohio University and welcome him to his own speaker series talk.
Well, thank you, Ingo. Those are very nice words, and I do appreciate them. I can't think of anybody that I would rather have succeed me after a decade at the CHI than yourself. I think it's been fantastic. There are a lot of people to thank when you write a book. And I wonder if actually the acknowledgments will be longer than the book itself. I haven't written the acknowledgments yet. You don't until you finish the book. But I have a huge list going, and many of the people in this room are people that I would have to thank, that I wish to thank, I should say. It's a pleasure to do so. Ingo is one of them. Ingo has read a couple chapters of the book. I have other people here, Catherine, John, and Paul, who've read, if not portions of the book, then almost all of it. I think Catherine, you've read all but one chapter. David Kerp has read and commented on chapters. Connie Hunter read the whole thing, cover to cover, and survived. But there are a lot of people, and I will thank everybody who's helped me. Of course, the one person I must thank is my wife, who's sitting here in the front row, and who has allowed Stalin to intrude on our marriage for the last decade. A ménage à gros. This, of course, is the cover, which shows you should never study Soviet history. The ravages of studying Soviet history have wreaked their havoc on me. I used to look like that. I don't anymore, sadly. So let's just move along and get out of that. First of all, I should begin with an apology. When I agreed to make this talk, when Ingo asked me to give the talk, it was back in the summertime, I think early summer, maybe even the spring. And I don't know if maybe it was Brian who asked me first, but in the spring, do a talk on your new book. Great, it'll be in between covers, it'll be wonderful. Well, it's not. It's not between covers, and for that, I really do apologize. I can only say that it's an awfully long book, 392,000 words in length, and that translates into typescript of over 1,300 pages. And I may have to cut just a little bit of it for the publisher. The editor and I are in conversation about that, and I have left all of my Christmas vacation to be ruined by trimming this somewhat. Okay, get on to the real subject of the book. Why this book? Why now? There are literally scores of thousands of books on the Second World War, and you'd be forgiven for asking yourself, is there really anything new to say about the Second World War? Particularly, everybody thinks they have a pretty good narrative of what happened in the Second World War. Even people who don't study history, have some idea about Stalingrad, Kursk, the Battle of Moscow, the Siege of Leningrad. On the so-called Eastern Front, as you said, which of course is derived from the Germans, we all have a sense of the general development of affairs. Okay, first and foremost, I say nothing of news or importance about the fighting. I have my opinions, and I deliver my opinions on them, but this is a pretty well-mined field when it comes to the actual operational history of the war. I have some new things to say about the strategic elements of the war, but virtually nothing new to say about operational history. My friend David Glantz, Colonel David Glantz, who spent his entire lifetime in Leavenworth, piece by piece, rebuilding what happened on the Eastern Front minute by minute, since his retirement has written 63 books on the operational history. 63 books on the operational history of the Eastern Front, and they're good if you want to know where every motorcycle battalion was and so forth. But they are pretty good. He also does analysis. Okay, so the war itself, in terms of fighting, has been done, and has been done very well. But of course, there were 192 million people in the Soviet Union when the Germans invaded. Only 35 million of those were ever in the army. There was a big country in addition to what happened at the front. There are a couple reasons that I have written this book. One, there has been no good comprehensive history of the Soviet Union at war since Alexander Wirth wrote his book, Russia at War, which is still in print, in 1964. When I tell people this, they at first they don't believe it. Every specialist that I say, when I tell them what I'm doing, says, it's about time somebody wrote a book like that, because it's there to be written. The second thing, there's only one history of the Soviet home front written over 20 years ago. It's 175 pages long, and it was written before any of the new documentation became available. Well, there is a lot of new documentation. There's a wealth of new documents from all sorts of different sources, which I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. This is actually the first-hand account of the liberation of Auschwitz, about a 40-page document that was only made public this year. So there's stuff coming out even as I had to actually take a chapter back from the publishers and add to it when I got this, because it's earth-shattering stuff. They really did investigate what happened at Auschwitz, and they reported on it. Not many Russian historians, historians of Russia, I should say, study the war. A lot of Russian historians study it. Not many Americans or British or even Germans write about the history of the war, in part because they see it as military history and think it's been done. Even fewer write about foreign policy, in large part because American historians of American foreign relations have so overwritten the history of the Cold War that people who do Russian history think surely there's nothing left to say. Well, there is. There's an awful lot of documentation on that as well. I've made a number of different, what I think are contributions to the history of the Second World War, but it's a big book, and I, of course, can't stand here and give you a rundown in 1,300 pages of text. You'd be quite justified in leaving before I got anywhere near doing that. It's not a monograph, so it doesn't have a single argument. It's a history of the war. But here's the thing, and this is what I discovered when I set out to write this so long ago and thought I'd be done in half the time. Much of it has not been written about. And so each of the chapters, and my chapters are longish, at 65 to 75 pages long, they were little books in and of themselves, and they had little arguments in and of themselves, but there's not a comprehensive overarching argument. I've made a number of what I think are new arguments, but not one big new argument. I've made contributions, I believe, particularly on the early years of the war. The cover that you saw is probably going to have to be revised because the title of the book is not The Soviet Peoples at War 1941 to 45, but 1939 to 1945, because a third of the war years took place, in Europe anyway, took place before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. And I have a lot to say about those years. They were the formative years of the war, and they're probably the most misunderstood years of the war. I'm going to be talking about that in some depth later on. I have stuff to say about Stalin's intelligence failure, supposed, in 1941, the crisis of the Soviet Union in the fall of 1941, when the Germans got to the gates of Moscow, and for 10 days there was no government in Moscow. There has been no attempt to explain why the Soviet Union didn't fall after it lost 80% of its army and the Germans had captured over half of its steel-making capacity, 2/3 of its aluminum capacity, and 40% of its food. Why didn't it collapse? I have some things to say about that. The history of the wartime Gulag. There are volumes after volumes after volumes of documents on the history of the Gulag now, the internal documents. For the first time, we can write the history of the Gulag from the inside. The traditional view has been that the Gulag shrank during the war. Actually, as a proportion of the Soviet Union, it grew, believe it or not. A proportion of the people under Soviet control, I should say. I have some things to say about the civil war that raged within the Soviet Union during the war. We are all familiar, of course, as I said, with the big battles of the war, but we're unaware, most of us, that behind the scenes, the Soviet-German war was more like the war in Yugoslavia than people think. It had a civil war as well, and I have a lot to say about that in the book. Okay, so I have a few things to say. There are more, but I won't burden you with them. Instead, I'm going to give you a sampler of just a couple points that I have something new to say about, where I differ from the traditional interpretation of the historical events. And I chose to, with some purpose. First is going to be the period of Stalin's collaboration with Hitler, because I have some I think, very interesting and new things to say about that. And it's a diplomatic, political, strategic history. But the second is going to be about women in the Red Army, because 2/3 of the book is a social history. I have some friends and colleagues who think that what I do is study warfare. I study a war. I don't study warfare quite so much. I study a country at war, and it's a revolutionary period. And I have new things to say, I think, anyway, about society at war. Okay, let's talk about the first. I love this cartoon. It's David Lowe, the New Zealander cartoon, showing Hitler and Stalin making their pact. Most books, as I said, that deal with the Eastern Front, so-called, it was the Western Front, by the way, from those of us who do Soviet history, jump right into the war against Hitler in June 1941 and give only prefatory remarks to the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact. That's unfortunate because the Soviet Union was not idle, it was involved in the war from day one. Not only did its pact with Hitler allow Hitler to launch his war in Poland and thus start the war in Europe, but also during the period of the pact, August 1939 until June 1941, the Soviet army invaded and occupied, in whole or in part, 6 countries. It was also the principal supplier of the German war machine during those years. Trotsky, who was only a year away from being murdered by Stalin's secret policeman when the war broke out, he always had a colorful turn of phrase, Trotsky, until he was killed. And he called Stalin Hitler's quartermaster, which actually is a pretty good term and actually a pretty accurate one as well. The conventional narrative about the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact is roughly this, and most of you have heard this because it's in every textbook. That Stalin signed his deal with Hitler to buy time. Stalin understood from the outset that he must eventually have to fight Hitler, and so he used the interval bought by the pact in order to prepare for the inevitable war against Hitler. You've all heard that, I think. Hitler is seen as the driver of events, and Stalin is portrayed as almost purely reactive against Hitler, who is the initiator of war and aggressor. Stephen Kotkin, who has just issued the 2nd volume of his massive 3-volume biography of Stalin, has a subtitle to the book called Waiting for Hitler. Okay, as though 1929 until 1941 was all about building up for the inevitable clash with Hitler. Kind of hard to do in 1929 since Hitler didn't come to power until 1933, but that's a small point. Even Vladimir Putin has made the same argument, believe it or not, that this was about buying time. This version of events admits that the USSR supplied the Germans, and also that the Soviet army invaded, how could it deny it, the Baltic states, Finland, and Romania. But these invasions are explained as an attempt on the part of the Soviet Union to build a defensive zone to protect against the possibility of a German attack. In other words, they're written into the narrative about this all being defensive. It's sometimes called a buffer. And I'm looking for my friend John Bropes when I use that term because it's anything but a buffer. A buffer is something that is between two empires. They eliminated the buffer when they destroyed Poland. Although Stalin massively increased the size of the Red Army during this period and reoriented industry to production, the narrative goes, he also failed to foresee the German attack when it came. I'm sure a lot of you have heard that too. He got Hitler wrong and was surprised in June 1941. He was supposedly warned by Churchill and Roosevelt. He was warned by Churchill and Roosevelt, but he didn't heed these warnings. And his generals in their memoirs in the 1960s all said, well, we told him it was coming. He just didn't listen to us. That foolish old Stalin, who managed to stay in power for 30 years, was apparently just utterly fooled by Hitler in a period of a few months. The explanation for this, for him being so blind to the threat, supposedly so blind to the threat of Hitler, was that he had created an echo chamber. He was a dictator after all, and people only told the dictator what he wanted to hear. That's one explanation. Or he was paranoid, and he thought the West was trying to draw him into a war, and so he overreacted. Or, and my favorite, is that he trusted Hitler. Anybody who spent as much time studying Stalin as I do don't think he didn't trust anybody. He once actually said, and literally he said, I don't trust anybody. Sometimes I even don't trust myself. That's a direct quote from Stalin. I doubt that he just trusted Hitler. Okay, so almost everybody in this room has heard versions of this narrative since it's omnipresent. It fit with the documents that we had up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for one reason, all those documents were German. And guess what? The Germans knew they were going to attack the Soviet Union. Hitler did anyway. Hitler knew it. We know it because we have the benefit of hindsight. So we know the war is coming. So we assume Stalin must have known the war was coming. Well, that's an assumption that shouldn't be taken for granted. It should be proven. And in fact, it turns out that it's largely untrue, at least in the early stages of the Nazi-Soviet pact. I don't contend that this narrative that I've just laid out is entirely wrong, but each and every point that it makes has to be revised. Okay, I see there being 3 periods, 3 phases to the Nazi-Soviet cooperation period. Usually it's seen as a sort of unitary period. He bought time, he prepared for the war, he screwed up, and the war hit before he was ready. No, there were actually distinct phases of this period. The first ran from August 1939, when the pact was signed, until June of the next year, when France fell. During this period, far from preparing for a war with Hitler, Stalin did a number of things that he would not have done had he expected an attack coming from the West. He was certainly happy to get the territory that Hitler promised him. He was also happy to stay out of an intra-capitalist war. He made that very clear. But he had no real grand strategy at the outset. It was opportunism. His strategy would grow and develop during his period of cooperation with Hitler. Stalin told his comrades that Germany, far from being the big threat, was the weaker power. Why? Because it did not have a navy, and it didn't have access to the world's raw materials. It was taking on an alliance, the British and the French, who had a much larger combined army and a far larger fleet. The German fleet was 15% the size of the British fleet at the outbreak of the war. They had no access to the world's raw materials. He actually tells his colleagues, there's a war on between two groups of nations. The weaker one, the Germans, is weak in raw materials and resources. Well, Stalin supplied that weakness. This is, of course, the pact, signing the pact. I like this picture. There's a whole bunch of pictures of this signing of this pact on the night of the 23rd, 24th of August, 1939. And one thing, and Patrick, you know what I'm going to say. Look at Stalin. He's smiling. You never have photographs of Stalin smiling. These are the only photographs. I know of one where he's doing this with his hands, but he almost never smiles in photographs. He was delighted because the capitalist powers were going to go at one another. And we do have good evidence of it. We see nothing wrong in their having a good, hard fight and weakening each other. The non-aggression pact is, to a certain degree, helping Germany. Next time, we'll urge on the other side. We actually have his thoughts recorded by Georgy Dimitrov, who was the head of the Comintern, as to why he signed the pact. It's like the smoking gun of the 20th century, because the Nazi-Soviet pact is in many ways the pivotal event of the 20th century, launching the world's most destructive war. At no place in that outline of his reasons does he say, ultimately we're going to have to fight Germany. He doesn't say that at all. He says instead, it would be a good thing if the British Empire were weakened as a result of this agreement. His principal enemy for the first year and a bit of the Nazi-Soviet pact was not the Germans, it was the British. And it's actually quite clear from the records. Okay, so he was able to supply, be Hitler's quartermaster, as Trotsky would have it. And the reason for this was not because he was trying to appease Hitler or buy time. He was stoking the fight. He thought the Germans were the weaker party and they needed the resources that only the Soviet Union could supply, particularly oil and food, but also a whole range of others. And he supplied all of these things. And he knew just to what extent the Germans were dependent on Soviet largesse. And I believe I'm the first historian in English to use the intelligence materials that were sent to Stalin. He had an excellent spy in Germany, in the economics ministry, a man named Arvid Harnack, who'd gone to the University of Wisconsin and had married an American woman named Mildred Fish. And he was leaking the top-level economic materials that Hitler was getting. The stuff that crossed Hitler's desk crossed Stalin's desk as well. And all of that stuff said, we're utterly dependent on the Soviet Union for our lifeline. Only the Soviet Union has the material that we need to prosecute this war. So he had excellent sources there. And he knew that the Germans were dependent on him. During this first period, as I said, Stalin supplied materials not to appease Hitler, but rather to provoke a war. Rather than prepare for a war, which is, of course, the dominant narrative, Stalin did a couple of very odd things. When he moved into Poland, September 17th, 1939, when the Germans defeated the Poles in the west, he moved in the east, took about half of Poland. He then dismantled his fortification line along the old frontier, the so-called Stalin line, which had been set up to protect the frontier. Dismantled it, took it apart, handed over some of the pillboxes to collective farms to grow mushrooms in, which is odd. He also launched his Big Fleet program. He had a program that aimed at constructing, and this is almost unbelievable, 16 battleships and 12 heavy cruisers, which would have made the Soviet Navy bigger than either the British or Japanese in terms of those particular ships. This was a big, big fleet program. I would put it to you that no Muscovite leader planning to fight Germany builds a big fleet to sail up the Rhine and shell the Ruhr. That's not what they were being built for. They were being built to contest the high seas. He did not expect a war at this stage against Germany anyway. He expected one against Britain. He told the Turks that he expected a war against Britain. He said, we don't have an alliance as such with the Germans, but war has its own dynamics. And he thought that the British would eventually come into a war against them and that they would have to side with the Germans. When he moved into Finland, November 1939, in accordance with the Nazi-Soviet pact, Finland fell within their sphere of influence. As you know, he almost got his head handed to him by the tiny Finns. They fought quite well. What you may not know is that the Soviets lost more dead in the short winter war from November 1939 until March 1940 than the Americans have lost in all their wars since the Second World War. A thought-provoking thought. In that war, they ended without occupying all of Finland for one reason. Soviet intelligence, which we now have, said that the British and French were going to get involved on the Finn side, and they're going to draw the Soviet Union into war. Stalin thought it was better to cut his losses and take half a loaf, and he did. So he made a deal with the Finns for a time being, but he intended to make a comeback at that. So this is my point. He thought the British and French were a threat. He also wanted the Turkish Straits. Why? Germany's not going to come at him from the Turkish Straits. But in his own writing, he says the British fleet is in the Mediterranean, and Britain intervened in the Russian Civil War and in the Crimean War in the Black Sea. If we control the Turkish Straits, we can stop that. He also wanted to control the Baltic states for the same reason. And again, if you read their internal documents, they don't say, we got to build a buffer state to stop Germany because they're going to invade us. No, he says the British intervened there in 1918 and 1919 with the British fleet. And we have to take the Baltic in order to secure our Baltic coastline. Okay, so this first period, up till the collapse of France, and I could go on and on, there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that Stalin did not see the Germans as a threat at all in this period. And by the way, common sense indicates that. Think of the situation. For all of these people, the principal war in their lives had been the Great War, had been the First World War, which had lasted 4 years and weakened all of the combatants. There was no reason to think that the Second World War would be slower, or that Germany would be able to knock France out in 2 weeks. Who could have predicted that? Stalin was, of course, a very effective statesman. I have a good deal of respect for his acumen, but he wasn't that good. He didn't foresee that France would collapse in the space of a few weeks. In fact, he thought that they would hold on for a long time and that Germany was the weaker power, and he said that explicitly. Okay, so when France fell, it was a nasty shock to the Soviets. But Stalin didn't panic. He told the British ambassador, and I quote, "To defeat France, this does not yet signify hegemony in Europe. In order to dominate Europe requires hegemony on the seas, and Germany does not have such hegemony. And it scarcely will have. Europe without sea lanes has no communications, no colonies, no minerals, no oil." So he still thought that Germany had an unfinished war on its hands, and was still dependent on Soviet raw materials, as indeed it was. And of course, he was getting intelligence information that affirmed that. Also, the United States starts to get involved in the war at about this time. In September, they signed the Destroyers for Bases deal, which was the beginning, which would culminate in the next year, in the Lend-Lease agreement, where the United States basically wrote a blank check for the British war effort. Stalin wrote an economic analysis of this in the fall of 1940, which I've read. It's unpublished, but it's about a 12-page document in Russian in his private papers. And he says, there's a war on between two great blocs. The Anglo-American bloc on the one hand, and on the other hand, Germany, Italy, and Japan. In other words, he was counting Britain and the United States in the same bloc, and he saw them as materially much stronger. And he was, after all, a Marxist. I know that it's fashionable to say, well, he didn't really think like that. Yes, he did. He thought in terms of tonnage, in terms of stuff. And the British and the Americans had a heck of a lot more stuff than the Germans. And the Germans didn't have any fleet. Moscow was certainly, after the fall of France, Moscow was certainly worried about the freed up German army. And for the first time, we have the General Staff plans. They start planning for a possibility, a contingency for a fight with Germany. But they don't see that as the only threat, and they don't even see it as the principal threat. But they do start planning for a possible war in the summer of 1940. Despite these precautions, though, Stalin still thought he could work with Hitler because of the American assistance to Britain, because of the unfinished war that Hitler had on his hands. Stalin said to several people, Hitler will never be as mad as the Kaiser was to make the mistake of fighting a war on two fronts. He has an unfinished war in the East and in the West, and he said this. He actually explicitly wrote this on a report from Berlin. He said, it's wrong to regard this war as over. Britain is still in the war. Stalin told several comrades during this period that he thinks it's wrong I've just said that. But after Molotov went to visit Hitler in November of 1940. And this has been written about a lot. But we've always written about this meeting from the German side because only the German records have been available. Well, we have a really interesting set of documents now. Stalin's instructions to Molotov when he went to Berlin. Also, his telegrams back and forth to Molotov while he was in Berlin. These are now available and haven't been used because people just aren't studying this period of history, thankfully. I was terribly worried, by the way, when Kotkin wrote his volume of the Stalin biography. I thought, oh my God, he's going to cite this stuff. No, he didn't read it, so that's just fine. My mentor at Rice used to say, never worry about a bad book, worry about a good book. And not that Kotkin's book is bad. It's a great book. When Molotov visited Hitler in November, he bargained hard. And at the end of this meeting, Stalin offered to join the Axis, November 25th, 1940. Now, we've known that for a long time, although it somehow drops out of a lot of histories. He offered to join in an alliance with Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. He had four terms for doing so. One is the Japanese should leave Sakhalin Island, which they'd taken from the Russians back in 1905, from the Tsar. That was the least important. The second was the Germans should get their troops out of Finland and recognize that this was a Soviet sphere of interest. And the General Staff wrote up another plan, this time to attack and take over all of Finland. And this time they weren't going to have to back down because the French were out of the war. And the British were in no place to fight on their own. So Finland. Third, the Turkish Straits. He wanted a Soviet base on the Turkish Straits to turn the Turkish Straits into a one-way turnstile for the Soviet Navy. It would have opened the straits for the Russian Navy to operate in the Mediterranean. It would have closed it for other states. And he told the Germans he demanded this, and he expected them to help if the Turks resisted. He also wanted Bulgaria as a satellite state because it's the approaches to the Turkish Strait. And finally, he wanted it recognized that the legitimate sphere of expansion for the Soviet Union, should be south of Batum and Baku toward the Persian Gulf, that is, into Iran and into Iraq. And the General Staff, again, obliged by drawing up plans to invade the place, with contingency plans to take on the British, should they intervene either from Iraq or from British India. So he was planning on, if you will, rolling the tables. But that doesn't stop there. He also had a grand strategy. I told you that his ideas evolved. He's not just reactive. This is a man who thought deeply and thought well about strategic matters. And here's his grand strategy, as laid out in these documents. First, it's explicitly directed against Britain. Britain is seen as the principal capitalist power. What he wants is for Britain to be driven out of Suez and Gibraltar, which would be fine and dandy. If the Turkish Straits were a one-way turnstile, it would mean that the Russians would dominate the Mediterranean as well. India would be given dominion status and the British army would be withdrawn. That would be fine and dandy too, because there would be no other army in Eurasia that could contest the Soviet army. Nothing could stop them if that was the case. Britain would be driven out of European affairs, would give a pledge not to be involved in European affairs, and would restore the German colonies that were lost in 1918 to German control. Okay, so that's Britain. In other words, these are terms you dictate to a defeated power. At the same time, he had a proposal for cooperating with the Axis. Germany was to get the west coast of Africa and expand down there, consolidate its European holdings, and then expand down the west coast of Africa. Italy was to expand southward across the Mediterranean. Japan, interestingly enough, he proposed that he would offer his good services to negotiate an end to the Sino-Japanese War, which was still raging, get the Japanese disengaged from China, and directed south and east toward the Dutch and British holdings in Southeast Asia and against the Americans. He even talked with Matsuoka about dividing India along the Indus River between a Soviet zone and a Japanese zone. So they were talking about partitioning the entire world. Now, historians up till now have sort of said, well, Stalin was just feeling out Hitler. No, he wasn't. This was his plan, and he actually told his comrades that he wanted to join the Axis as soon as the terms regarding Bulgaria were accepted. These larger views, these larger aims, he thought would be hammered out in further meetings in Moscow. He thought that either Hitler or Ribbentrop would make a return visit to Moscow, and he, Stalin, would negotiate these terms directly. So he was thinking big. And as I said, they followed up this thinking with general staff plans. And again, I look at my friend John Brobst. This would have been victory in the great game. It would have meant the defeat of Britain, which has always acted like a cork in the bottle of Russian expansionism to the south and into the Balkans and towards Turkey. It would have eliminated the British cork, and it would have meant that the Soviets or the Russians were dominant in Eurasia. Okay, well, it didn't work out. Hitler had other plans, right? He signed the plan to invade the Soviet Union on December 18th, which was only a few days after Stalin had offered to join the Axis. The Germans never responded to Stalin's offer. Interesting that. Never responded to it. Every once in a while, the Soviets would say, how about that offer? Are you going to answer it? And they'd say, we're thinking about it. Well, they thought about it for a long time, up until June 22nd. There is a third and final phase, and it runs from April of 1941 until the invasion. Things go sour, and Stalin recognized it, that things were going sour. And he recognized it because the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, they invaded Greece, they sent troops into Bulgaria and Romania, all of which were regarded as vital interests to the Soviet Union. It certainly violated the spirit of Nazi-Soviet cooperation. The Soviets quietly complained, and the Nazis ignored it. As Goebbels said in his diary at this time, the Russian card is no longer Trump's. I love that phrase. The Russians, in other words, can't dictate terms to us. I'm driving them away. Okay, so about intelligence matters and the lead up to the invasion. This is Stalin's grand strategy, but the lead up to the invasion, Stalin didn't ignore his warnings. He actually had pretty good warnings, and 5 volumes of these things are now available if you want to read them in Russian. They're from the GRU, they're from the NKVD, and they're very good. They detailed all sorts of stuff. They detailed the unit buildups in the east. They talked about the aerial buildup. They talked about fuel dumps. They pointed out that the rail cars that the Germans possessed were being re-gauged for the Soviet gauge. They talked about operational detachments that were intervening in the Soviet Union or invading the Soviet Union. It was very good intelligence information. Stalin had almost as good intelligence information about the location of German troops as Hitler did. Okay, so why the so-called surprise? He had great information about the disposition of German troops. He had no good information about their intention and their plans. And their plans could be debated. And here's the thing. The British weren't certain what was going to come next. Both the British and the Soviets actually made the same mistake in assessing Hitler's plans. They assumed that Hitler would go after Britain first and take Britain out, knock Britain out of the war before it turned east against the Soviet Union. They both made that same erroneous assumption. Come back to Churchill's warning. Churchill in his memoir said, but I warned Stalin. I sent him a note in early April and said, he's coming at you. And Stalin just ignored me. He's a dictator. He called him the most bamboozled person of the Second World War. Well, Stalin had very good information, really good information. His best spy at this point, he had other spies, but his best spy was a man named John Cairncross, who had access to all the Joint Intelligence Committee reports. And so Stalin is getting warned by Churchill. They're coming at you. You better get ready. Hitler's going to attack you. And he's reading the British intelligence. And the British intelligence are saying, they're not going to attack the Soviet Union this summer. They're going to attack us this summer. If you were Stalin, who would you believe? A prime minister who's trying to draw you into a war? Or the prime minister's secret intelligence stuff, what your opponent is saying behind closed scenes. He did increase the raw materials exports to Germany during this period. He certainly did that. And that's for appeasement, because he figured Germany has a war on its hands. It needs these goods in order to fight that war. It might come at us if it needs those resources and we don't give it to them. So if we give it to them, they'll fight their war and leave us alone, at least for a year. There's another element that led to the confusions of 1941. The Germans had a disinformation campaign. Thanks again to my colleague John Brobst about the history of the intelligence surprise. And it makes it sound like I get all my sources from John. I should. John, could you talk about Roberta Wohlstetter? Just 80%. Okay, just the best parts. But Roberta Wohlstetter did a study of the surprise at Pearl Harbor, and she said that there are two elements to intelligence. You have signals and noise. Signals is what the enemy's actually doing. Noise is distractions, other stuff, telling you things that aren't going to happen. I'd add a third element to this, which is disinformation. The Germans had a disinformation campaign going from February on to suggest that they had not yet made up their mind about their attack against the Soviet Union. And they pushed this disinformation campaign all the way through occupied Europe. And you can see Stalin getting it from Poland. He had a great spy in Finland, but that spy was feeding him disinformation, saying, the Germans are going to make up their mind in July as to whether or not they're going to attack you. And essentially what this disinformation campaign said was that the politicians led by Ribbentrop said, we should use this army to blackmail the Soviet Union. Whereas the generals under Goering, who wasn't a general, want to invade right away and take all the resources for themselves. So they both want the same thing, but they're arguing over whether there should be a war or not. So Stalin took this stuff to heart and tried very hard to avoid provoking the Germans. He didn't want to give the war party, as he saw it, an opportunity to launch a war. Now you can say, well, this is crazy. Hitler was calling the shots. Again, that's wonderful in hindsight. Stalin wasn't that foolish. After all, this is the way Imperial Japan behaved. They had interest groups that were warring over war plans. And it wasn't unreasonable to think that the same thing was happening in Germany. And he was getting this information from any number of sources. Here's another thing. A lot of sources pointed to war. And again, there's this predisposition on the part of historians to go back and say, look, you were warned. Here's a document. It says attack. Well, yes, there were documents that said that the Germans were going to attack. Most of them said, and I've read them, most of them said they'll attack, but only after Britain's finished. Or they said they'll attack in May. Well, May came and May went and there was no attack. In all the ones that I've read, I've only seen one that said there might be a surprise attack. All the rest said there might be an attack, but they're going to make demands. They're going to make demands in terms of territory, or they're going to make demands in terms of resources, or in terms of military assistance. Only one, and only in passing, said there might be a surprise attack. Okay, so Stalin read all this stuff. He was not ignorant. He was not oblivious to the warnings, nor did he ignore them. But the warnings were not clear, and they were consistent with the notion that, in fact, there might be room for a negotiation. And so he hoped up until the very end that there would be room for negotiation with the Germans. He thought the Germans would present demands, and he might make this into some kind of deal or bargain that would at least postpone an attack through the summer of 1941. As mad as Hitler is, he wouldn't have invaded the Soviet Union in September at the outset of bad weather. He needed at least a summer in order to finish off the Soviet Union. So Stalin thought that he might be able to at least buy his way through 1941 and continue to arm. Nor did he ignore defenses. This is another thing that's just utterly untrue. People say he didn't prepare for the attack. He did. He mobilized 800,000 men, but he didn't send them to the frontier because he was afraid that the German intelligence would pick it up and that they would use this to provoke a war. So he mobilized them and sent them to a second line near Smolensk. This actually ended up saving his regime because these folks were far enough away from the front that when the German invasion came, they weren't surrounded and destroyed. Had they actually been sent to the front, they probably would have fallen into entrapment as well. He had a second line of defense when he actually needed one. So he took measures to defend himself. So the question is, where does the attack does come? And the argument is that Stalin is surprised. Well, he's not surprised. What you've got instead is Molotov telling the British. Molotov said, though the Soviet military authorities had anticipated the possibility of war, they had never expected that it would come without any discussion or ultimatum. My argument would be they weren't surprised by the war. They weren't certainly surprised by the buildup or by the possibility of a German attack. They were surprised by the surprise. They thought that there would be a period, they'd get a warning in the terms of demands. And it never came. Instead, it was an attack because Hitler's demands were your utter destruction. Hitler didn't have terms that you could negotiate. Well, destroy half of us? I mean, there's nothing to negotiate in that. The Soviets were actually well prepared in terms of numbers. They had 24,000 tanks. The Germans had 3,500 when they invaded the Soviet Union. They were a much bigger army potentially, with of course a huge amount of manpower. And they were as well prepared as the Soviet Union could be. And I think that's a very, very important point. So where's this myth come that Stalin was utterly surprised, or that he trusted Hitler, or that he misread the intelligence, or he ignored the intelligence? We know that he didn't. We know what he read, and he read it very carefully. Stalin dies in 1953. The first Soviet real accounts of the Second World War come out during the Khrushchev years, when the generals published their memoirs. The first 6 months of the war against Germany were a disaster. The Soviets started out with 5.4 million men. By December, they'd lost 3.3 million prisoners of war, and just under 2 million dead and wounded. 80% of the army disintegrated, and the Germans got to the gates of Moscow, and as I said, very nearly took Moscow itself. Not a great record. And the generals conveniently blamed Stalin for the defeat. Oh, if he'd gotten it right, we had all our plans in order. If he'd only warned us, we'd have been fine. It covered up their many, many, many sins. They could blame everything on the dead dictator, and they leaked very selected intelligence information that made it look like Stalin was oblivious to the warning. He wasn't. And you can actually prove this by going back and looking at these materials. So that is really the first line of argument that I have to make about the Second World War, and I really haven't left myself a whole lot of time, other than to make a few points about women in the Red Army. It was, yes, here they are being sent off to fight. When the war broke out, there were only 1,000 women in the Red Army. There's a myth about the Red Army, and I'll just deal with a couple of myths very, very quickly. I'll deal with more in question and answer if you'd like. The myth is that the Soviets had positive gender programs, and that because of this, they mobilized women into the Red Army in the ways that the rest of the warring powers did not. Red Army women fought at the front in large numbers. They played a decisive role, supposedly, and it also showed that the Soviet Union was adept at mobilizing its human capacities. Well, no, actually. When the war broke out, remember, Stalin knew that war was a danger, and he'd increased between the period of 1939 and 1941, when the Germans attacked, he'd increased the size of the Red Army from 1.8 to 5.4 million men. He didn't increase the number of women mobilized at all. When the Germans attacked, as I say, there were about 1,000 women in the Red Army. That was fewer than in the British Army, and get this, it was fewer than in the German Army. The Nazis aren't well known for their positive and upstanding gender policies. They had more women. The British also had a higher percentage of women, interestingly enough. 10% of the British armed forces were women, 8% were, the Russians were, the case was 8%. There were more Russian women in the armed forces. There were 900,000 some odd women in the Soviet armed forces. But of course, the Soviet Union's a bigger place. They did not mobilize women effectively into the Soviet armed forces until the second year of the war, the spring and summer of 1942. And they did it not because they thought, gee, we want to give women an opportunity to show what they can do in warfare. It was because they couldn't believe that the German army could survive the Battle of Moscow and the retreat, and then revive itself enough to launch a second offensive towards Stalingrad and break through the front. They had to get every living person that they could at the front or in factories. And so they drafted women into the war effort, not in 1941 initially, not because of effective planning or positive gender policies, but because of dire necessity. And they brought women into the army to replace men at every level where they could. They did create a couple of female units, an air unit with 300 pilots. They created a women's rifle battalion of 6,000 people, but they never sent it to the front, which was actually a retrograde step from the Tsars, who actually did send a female battalion into combat. Only 2,500 women actually served at the front in combat units. The myth of female tank drivers and machine gunners is precisely that. It's a myth. A lot of women saw combat, but that's because of the fluid nature of modern war. Most women in the Red Army served in the medical corps or in support units, truck drivers, telegraphists, communications specialists, and so forth, but particularly in the medical corps, a very traditional role, gender role anyway. They were very effective in that regard, and I don't mean to diminish it. 41% of doctors in the Soviet Army were women, 100% of nurses were women, and they sent some 75% of wounded people back into combat, including people who've been wounded up to 7 times. I have accounts of people who were sent back in to man an artillery post when they were still walking on crutches. They sent people back into combat in cases that the British and American armies would have sent them home. But they were patched up, they were treated, and largely by female doctors and female medical units. So they did play an important role, not in the early stages of the war, but later on. In the pursuit of the Germans into Central Europe and the defeat of the Germans in their home. However, as the war neared an end, the Soviets realized they had another problem, a huge population deficit. The Soviets lost probably 27 million men during the war, people during the war, 27 million. It's estimated that they probably lost some 40 million due to premature causes. In other words, people dying of disease or from wounds incurred during the war. So a loss of 40 million people from a population of 192 million people, you do the math. The Soviet planners said, we need children. And they started to demobilize women in 1944, and they started to establish things like Hero Mother Awards for producing children as though they were like giving birth to hogs or something like that. But the top one was 10 or more kids, which is almost unthinkable. But the 10 kids, and it only counted, by the way, if the child lasted beyond its first birthday. If it died in the first year, tough luck. That didn't count. You didn't get a medal. They also made divorce more difficult. They encouraged, in other words, traditional families in order to rebuild what they saw as the Soviet population problem. Returning veterans, female veterans, were badly treated. And this is really one of the scandals of the war, and there are a lot of scandals of this war. But one of the scandals of the war was that the Soviet regime said, don't sing your praises, we'll do it for you, and then didn't. Soviet women's achievements in the war were they're more celebrated in the West than they are in Russia, incidentally. There's a lot more interest in Soviet women in the United States than there is in the Russian historiography. When women returned from the front, many of them were treated as though they were licentious, as though they'd gone to the front only in order to fool around. There was a good deal of fooling around at the front. It wasn't fooling around. A lot of it was rape and sexual assault. Made worse, I mean, there is sexual assault in other countries, I've heard. Recently, I believe it's been in the news in the United States and in Britain. The problem was even worse in the Soviet Union because of the authoritarian nature of the state, the fact that there was no independent courts, no independent press. There was no way that a person who was pushed could object. And of course, the secret police could have you arrested if you didn't comply. And there are many, many cases that I'd be happy to talk about where such things occurred. So power, of course, the differential power certainly victimizes a great many women who served at the front. There's no evidence at all that women went to the front so they could get husbands or that so they could have a happy sex life. But nonetheless, they were treated that way at the end of the war by the population as a whole. And this is true. You can read veterans' comment after veterans' comment after veterans' comment. They said we were called frontovaya or frontovichka, those frontline girls. And we were not regarded as good marriage prospects. There was a huge differential between men and women at the end of the war because so many young men had been killed, and a lot of parents didn't want their son to marry somebody who was damaged goods at the front. So the sting in the tail is not only do they have to fight the war, but then they're not given credit for it, and I will go to the very end, to my very last, no, I guess that's not my very last thing. The last slide here, which would say basically women were seen instead as having been rescued by Red Army men, as having been victims of the Nazis and rescued by Red Army men, rather than having been the agents of their own rescue. And that is probably as best I can sum up the tragedy of Red Army women in the Second World War. So with that, as a sampler, I would like to open it to questions. Yes, Mike.
Your discussion about how the Soviets had supplied Germany with a lot of material in the early years, it made me think of the Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze.
Yes, good book.
And so with Albert Speer being kind of the magician and trying to balance all these different things, but and I can't remember when that book exactly starts and time-wise, but how does that play into that? So there's that narrative that Adam Tooze presents about how the Germans, because I don't remember at least reading about the Soviets being involved in this and helping with the economy, at least in the early years. So I was just wondering your take on that.
Oh, Tooze does talk about it in some detail, but most of Tooze's book, The Wages of Destruction, are about the period after 41, and he says the Germans they didn't have the capacity economically to do what they were trying to do, that it was a very, very long shot. But the Soviets certainly supplied them with stuff without which they could not have prosecuted the war, particularly food and oil. I've got in the book, when the Soviets would have run out, when Hitler would have run out of all these commodities, and in such cases, rubber, they wouldn't even have started the war with any rubber holdings. They would have run out of oil, I think, in September. They would have run out of food in October. Instead, they had, thanks to Stalin, they had stores sufficient to last into 1942. And the difference here is that Stalin believed that the war would be a long one. You know, the First World War. He didn't think the Soviet Union was going to collapse. He thought it would be an extended war, and that Hitler wouldn't fight an extended war because he didn't have the stuff to do it. Hitler expected to win in 6 to 8 weeks. It's of differences of opinion like that wars are fought. I don't know if I answered your question, but Tooze's book is very good, but not about the Soviet economy, which he makes some statements about the Soviet economy that are utterly unfounded. But it's very, very, very good on the German economy. It's a model of its kind, really. I think it's an excellent book. Yes?
I thought your description of Stalin in 1939 and 1940 was really interesting, as a statesman looking for alliance partners. And it seems to mirror Stalin after Barbarossa, and the way he works with the Western alliance partners against Nazi Germany. Do you see any similarity in his attitudes there?
Oh, absolutely. His territorial demands remained almost identical. That's the one thing he changed his partners, but his demands don't change a whole lot. He wanted Eastern Poland, he wanted the Baltic states, he wanted the Finnish territories that he'd taken. And if you'll remember, he pushes for the northern portion of Iran. He also pushes for a revision of the Turkish Straits. So, you know, partners come and go, geography doesn't change. And his demands didn't change a great deal. I think he liked dealing with the Nazis. He actually says in a couple of places, these people are dynamic and they have imagination, unlike Chamberlain and his ilk. He saw the British as being unimaginative and unwilling to think big. And I think he was mystified by, he saw Churchill as an outright enemy. That's pretty clear. He was mystified by Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt didn't make sense because Roosevelt didn't want to talk like Hitler had talked. And it was a bit confusing in the early stages. There's been a lot written about the Roosevelt-Stalin the Roosevelt-Stalin relationship. You know, did they befriend one another? Did they trust one another? You know, when you actually add up all the time they spent, subtract the time spent being translated, you know, they spent maybe a couple hours in each other's company. Not much, just a few, and of really exchanging ideas. And I think that Roosevelt was a bit mystifying to Stalin. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you've come across any research on newly released material from the archives about whether Stalin actually had the army plan a preemptive strike against Hitler?
The Suvorov argument. Suvorov's argument, in a book called Icebreaker, he argued that Stalin was building up to attack Hitler when Hitler was distracted in the West, that his army buildup was almost purely offensive, that he saw Hitler as an icebreaker. In other words, he'd weaken the capitalist world and then Stalin would sweep in from behind with a preventative war. And that he was beaten to the punch by only a month. Suvorov doesn't help his case by the fact that he invents documents. He says, yeah, I saw this document, a Politburo record. You say, well, where? Well, it was there. And nobody else has been able to find it. He's part right. He did see Hitler as a wrecking ball, and he refers to him as that. He says Hitler unconsciously is destroying the capitalist world. We're using him as a tool. So he saw the fight between the capitalists as weakening the capitalist world, from which the Soviet Union in unspecified ways would benefit. In the early stages, I don't think he had any clue at all. As I said, he developed this grand strategy. One thing that he desperately wanted to do, though, was avoid a face-to-face war against a great power. He thought instead that it would be the height of cleverness to watch the other powers destroy one another and have him pick up the pieces. And you could do that if you had a fleet. And you could do it if you had a big army, and so he tried to build both. There is no evidence. There is a preemptive war plan. Zhukov, in the spring of 1941, presented Stalin with a preemptive war plan to hit Hitler before Hitler attacked. There's no evidence that Stalin read it. He signed off on other plans. He didn't sign off on that one. And Stalin, from my read, was not a big risk taker. He was a person who thought history was on his side, and history would provide a lot of goodies if you were patient and worked hard. He never approved that plan. It never went anywhere. As for the offensive structure of the Soviet army, that can be explained by a very simple fact. Soviet military doctrine was offensive. Stalin thought the defensive was ridiculous, and that the Soviet Union should strive to fight the war on the enemy's territory, and so that they didn't suffer all the destruction from previous wars. So it was an offensive doctrine. He thought the offensive was in the ascendant at this time because of the internal combustion engine and tanks and aircraft. So he didn't plan to defend. He sought to attack. But the idea was to absorb the first blow and counterattack. Does that make sense to you? Yes. Robert?
You spoke a great deal about the place of Britain in Stalin's geopolitical imagination, at least up until...
It's the Probst effect.
What was the place, if any, of the United States as this other sort of marching figure
Right.
nation in Stalin's geopolitical vision, at least up until the Nazi invasion?
Up until the Nazi invasion, he saw the United States primarily as Mr. Moneybags, as the ultimate guarantor of the British war effort, of opening up its coffers and giving the British everything they needed to fight the war. He didn't see the United States yet as a tremendous military power, and it wasn't. He saw it as a tremendous industrial power. He's very aware of that. And he saw this as being the ultimate reason why the British wouldn't lose the war. And when the British ambassador in the summer of 1940 says, well, what would happen if we just made terms with Hitler and put our navy into harbor and didn't stop Hitler at all? And Stalin's comment was, you forget the United States. They'll deny the oceans of the world to the Germans. So he was thinking in strategic terms about the United States. Not a lot explicitly, but mostly economically. Yes? Oh, sorry. No, it's okay, you.
You mentioned at the beginning the Soviet gulags expanded during the war. Was that because of German prisoners, or was that internal?
I should correct that. They actually declined in the number of prisoners. They increased as a proportion of Soviet society under Moscow's control. Okay, a couple things that I learned from studying the Gulag during the war. The death rate in 42 was 24.9% per annum. Okay, so you have a lot of people dying. They took 1 million and some people out of the Gulag, gave them amnesty, and put them into the Red Army. So 1 million are taken out, 1/4 per year are dying, and it still doesn't disappear, which must mean that they're putting people in. But here's the clicker. 40% of the Soviet population was under German occupation. If you do an analysis of what that number means as a proportion of Soviet population under Moscow's control, it actually increases. Does that make sense to you?
So, who are the people that live there?
Who goes in? One of the things that's very interesting, I mean, read the chapter. It's a very good book coming out on this. It's a lot of women. There were 7% of the Gulag population before the war was female. By the end of the war, it's over 30%. Many of these people were people who violated workplace statutes. If you left your work, particularly if you were in defense work, if you left your work without permission, that was regarded as desertion. And you got a term in the Gulag. If you were late 3 times, you were punished with a term in the Gulag. You have a lot of women flushed into the system during the war. And you have other people sent for the Soviet Union is a fairly punitive place. One interesting thing, though, that I found out, this is, Red Army commits probably 2 million rapes when it enters into Germany in 1944-45. Only 7,000 Soviet soldiers, Soviet people, were convicted of rape during the war. Odd. Yes.
When you were talking about Stalin's kind of strategic intentions in 1939 in historiography and kind of the myths that were propagated,
Yeah.
Especially one that he kind of mistook Hitler's intentions, and also that he was trying to buy time in 1939 by closing Birthrate Straits for the war. That
Yes.
would come. It kind of struck me that that's kind of the same as what history has said about Britain's intentions with appeasement, and that Chamberlain misunderstood or kind of didn't understand Hitler, and also that Britain in 1938 was buying time to build the Spitfires and Hurricanes that would win battle in Britain in 1940, which was hindsight. Have you kind of seen any blend between those two histories that maybe what we have thought about Chamberlain and Britain in 1938 is kind of affected Stalin?
I haven't seen a whole lot of comparison in that line, but one thing I would say, and I have said it in the book, is that Stalin was only the last person to get Hitler wrong. Hitler was a unique statesman. This kind of a programmatic planner, conqueror, is unusual in history. Somebody who actually has an idea of how he wants to transform the world and then sets about trying to do it ideologically is very unusual. Most people respond to the situation as it develops. Hitler was unusual in that regard, and he was unappeasable, as Chamberlain would find out, but so would Stalin. Stalin, in the end, did try to appease him only in the sense of trying to buy at least enough time to get through the summer of 41. And it had no more success. You have the Germans saying, look at them. They're clearly afraid of us now. They're actually contemptuous of Stalin's efforts to appease them. That actually reinforces their notion that the Soviets are weak and will collapse with a good kick. The famous line is, you kick the door, we kick the door in, the whole rotten structure will collapse, which my friend David Kerp says, yeah, and it did. But instead of being a peasant hut, it was the Winter Palace. And there are a lot of doors. It's a good point, David. Yeah. Jen.
You're thinking about Isaac Deutsch.
Uh-huh. Don't we all?
In his portrayal of Stalin, one often gets the sense that Stalin is not the sharpest tack in the box. Always very clever, always very genius, but his intellect is always questioned.
The graveyards are filled with people who questioned his intellect.
That leads into my question. With this research, has it changed your appraisal
Yes.
of Stalin's intellect? How?
Yeah. Deutscher was a Trotskyite, a genuine follower of Trotsky. Trotsky was contemptuous of Stalin. He thought he was a mediocrity. He thought he was a dullard. Well, politically, he was a lot more adept than Trotsky. I would point out to you that Trotsky was killed by Stalin, not vice versa, and that Stalin stayed in power for 30 years. I think he was ruthless. He was utterly ruthless. He didn't give a fig for human life. I think he was probably a sociopath, although we're not supposed to make diagnoses of people in power without interviewing them, I'm told. But I think he was somebody utterly without a conscience and willing to sacrifice anything for utilitarian purposes to get the end. But he had a steel-trap mind when it came to memory. He also, and everybody says this, Zhukov, Churchill, Roosevelt, he could grasp a strategic idea faster than anybody they met. He could grasp it and he could understand the ramifications of the strategic idea. So he had a first-rate mind. And also, Trotsky always said, hey, he doesn't speak any foreign languages. Stalin was born in Georgia, which does not speak Russian. Stalin operated in a second language his whole life. which I think there's this underestimation of the man because he was not flamboyant in his talk. He kept his own counsel in a party filled with chatterboxes. He was smart enough not to talk. I don't have any admiration for the man. I think he was a criminal in many ways, and utterly ruthless. And I've never made comparisons between Hitler and Stalin. I think it's a foolish thing to do. But he's in the same stratosphere when it comes to monsters of history. But that doesn't mean he was stupid. He was not stupid. And one of the things that I think I've contributed to here is making a reasonable explanation of why he thought what he thought in the spring of 1941. Rather than resorting to the sort of magic factor of saying, well, he suddenly became insane and just stopped reading the evidence. You can actually say, this is the evidence he had, and he gave it a very good read and a very reasonable read. Yes, he got it wrong. I think the United States in particular ought to be slow in condemning other countries for intelligence failures. It does happen, I'm told. Lon.
To sort of follow up, what are your thoughts on the Roosevelt-Stalin relationship?
You know, I don't have a lot new to say on that, and you probably have more to say, or at least as much or more to say on it than I do. As I said, I think he found Roosevelt somewhat mystifying because Roosevelt sent mixed signals. In particular, I know the discussions of 1942. Molotov was sent to negotiate in 1942 the western borders of the Soviet Union and possibility of a second front. Molotov didn't think that the Americans were in a position to promise the opening of a second front. He didn't think they had the wherewithal to do it. But he wanted to put Roosevelt on the wrong foot and get him to promise something he couldn't deliver so that then the Soviet Union could use this as propaganda. Roosevelt was genuinely trying to meet Molotov on these things. He was prepared, and he said it, and you know this, he was prepared to sacrifice 100,000 lives in order to prevent the Soviet Union from collapsing in 1942 by opening a front in France, even if it meant the destruction of the expeditionary force. Roosevelt was sincere in that. Stalin and Molotov did not believe in sincerity. In fact, one of Stalin's famous comments was, "Gratitude is a dog's disease." Like I said, he was sharp, but he was ruthless. Yes.
What do you say was going on in Moscow with Stalin in, I don't know, was it November, December, where he was kind of collapsing the government? And I heard, that Stalin...
October really was the collapse, yeah.
But he kind of withdrew entirely.
Oh no, you're conflating two different things. The withdrawal supposedly is in June of 1941, right after the attack, where he supposedly hid. He didn't appear in public. Then the government, you're right, does nearly collapse in October, but they're two separate events. The disappearing from public. Let me address that. An utter myth. And that's actually one of the things that I've been able to disprove in detail. He never cowered under his chair or hid from his comrades or anything of the sort. We have his appointments diary, where we know who he met and for how long and when in the entire period of the war. He was at his desk and operating, and we have memoir accounts, we have documentary accounts, and we have his diary to prove that he was in position and operating during the first week of the war. When Minsk fell on June 27th, he seems to have been shaken because they lost 600,000 men. And there was no armed force between the German army and Moscow. Had Hitler decided to drive directly on Moscow, nothing was there to stop him. And he did panic, and he stayed home for a portion of an afternoon. And a delegation of the Politburo went out to coax him to come back and to reorganize the state structure and to create the State Committee on Defense with him as chairman. And they brought him back. He thought they were coming to arrest him, supposedly, for the failure. But they came, these were guys who weren't going to take Stalin on. And they knew that overthrowing Stalin in the midst of a war would lead to their destruction as well as Stalin's. And so they begged to have him come back, and he came back. He may have been testing him. Who knows? Stalin was a devious man, as you might know. The second thing, though, October, when the Germans got to Moscow, I think the 15th was the day that all hell broke loose. The Stalin ordered the evacuation of all the principal ministries, only leaving a skeleton ministry in Moscow. He told his Politburo colleagues to leave. He said he was going to leave the next day. And half of Moscow fled. And for 10 days, there was almost disorder in Moscow. They had to rely in the end on the NKVD Dzerzhinsky division to come in and set things right. And I liken that in the book to the old guard being thrown in at Waterloo. This was the last line of defense for the Soviet state. The Soviet state very nearly fell. There were disorders in Moscow, in Rostov, in Voronezh, in Ivanovsk. Leningrad was surrounded. It very, very nearly fell. And it didn't for a host of reasons, which I'd be happy to talk about if I were invited back. Any other questions? Yes, what? Caitlin.
So, you mentioned you're talking about sexual violence on the front. What percentage of that was perpetrated by the Nazis, or what percentage was perpetrated by the Soviet army itself?
I wasn't even talking about the Nazis. I was talking about just within the Soviet army. The question was about sexual violence on the Eastern Front, what was perpetrated by the Nazis and what by the Soviets. It's almost impossible to caricature the wickedness of the Nazis in the East. You almost can't overstate it. It was almost a free fire zone. And in terms of sexual abuse, it was quite common. I was purely talking about the dynamics. Once you brought 900,000 women into the armed services suddenly, into a very authoritarian, very violent culture, they shot 157,000 of their own men during the war, soldiers. They arrested almost 1 million for desertion and collaboration and various other things. So the secret police regime was very strict. And you could be arrested for complaining about food and shot for complaining about food. Another factor is you have 34.5 million people serve in the army during the war. 8.6 million died in combat. Let that sink in. 8.6 million people die in combat out of a force of 34 million. That's a huge death rate. And it's even more impressive when you think front line is only a portion of any army. It meant that if you went to the front, you basically, particularly in the first 2 years of the war, was a death sentence. So you were living under sentence of death, effectively. There was violence around you. The state itself was violent. You were given 100 grams of alcohol to drink every day, which is 3.82 ounces of alcohol. It's a lot, particularly on an empty stomach. And this was a hungry army, believe me. And people pooled the alcohol and would get raging drunk. You got guns, you got violence, you got the prospect of death, and you drop women into the middle of this with no protections legally. There was a lot of sexual abuse. How much? Somebody should write a book about it. I've only done it as a portion of a chapter and said this is something that really needs research. I don't know how you do it because I doubt that the Army kept records. But there's plenty of memoir accounts that say this was a serious problem. Does that make sense? They're two separate things entirely, and I don't mean to downplay the sexual violence in the occupied zone at all. Yes, Bob.
You mentioned a report on
Auschwitz?
entry to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that you found different in the conventional or prevailing view of Soviets, the narrative about the Soviets and the concentration camps and then the Jews, I guess more generally?
You mean, did this accord with what we now know or think we know about Auschwitz? It was a pretty good stab at it. They had interviewed, I think there were 4,000 survivors from Auschwitz, and the Soviets interviewed all of them. They also interviewed the guards that fell into their custody. So it was a pretty good attempt. What they didn't do, and I read this back in February, but what they didn't do is have a comprehensive picture of how this fit into the death camp system. They did call it a camp of death. I don't know that they realized that it was part of this comprehensive Holocaust, but they certainly saw it as a lethal camp, and it's unsparing in its description. It really should be translated because it's the first-hand account, and it's the only one that was based on comprehensive interview with all the survivors that could be gathered.
Was there a lot of evidence that the Soviets, like they did, I guess, when the approach to Warsaw, I believe they allowed the Nazis to,
No, but I'll tell you one thing. The reason this document appeared now, this is interesting, because for 60 years the Soviets said, the Holocaust wasn't directed at Jews, it was directed at Soviet people, directed against communists. And this document was kept classified for years and years and years. And you say, well, why? Because it counters that narrative. It's clearly directed at the Jewish people. So why produce it now? Because the Ukrainians, in their argument with Russia, said that Ukrainian units had liberated Auschwitz. And the Russians said, no, it was the Soviet army. Here's the proof. And so they dumped this document. Now, knowing as I do how the Soviets, it was on the Ministry of Defense website, knowing as I do that documents come and go in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, it might be on there for a month and then it might disappear and you can never get it again. I went through and took screenshots of every single document to make sure I had them in my possession. So that's why if you look at it, if you looked at it, it's a little fuzzy. But yeah, I don't want those things to disappear. Somebody else is probably doing it, but I want them in my own collection.
Do you devote a chapter or significant part of a chapter in looking at the concentration camps?
Oh yeah. No, I do talk about I talk about the Holocaust in two places. One is in 1941. Half the Holocaust in the Soviet Union occurred in the first 6 months of the war. Something that I really hadn't really realized before I wrote the book is almost half the victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens, if you count Poland, where they moved, and the Baltic states. So almost half, just under half. And almost half of those were dead 6 months after the invasion. I hadn't realized just how fast it happened. It's quite different than the Holocaust image that we have. We have the Holocaust image that's derived from Knight and from Anne Frank's diary. Jews are segregated, they're forced to wear a yellow star, eventually they're taken away or they're hidden and they're rooted out and sent east and killed. In the Soviet Union, it was quite different. The Einsatzgruppen would come in and sometimes 3 or 4 days after the Wehrmacht went through and shoot all the Jews in town. And it was very, very quick. Some of the biggest massacres were in the fall of 41. And about half the Jewish population was dead by then. Yes.
How much of an impact did it make on
Soviet
the army when Russia stopped sending resources? And where were they getting them from? And also, if it wasn't much of an impact, how come Stalin thought it would be a bad?
Okay, good questions, both of them. By the way, one of the things that I do make a new contribution on is I have the NKVD documents from the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact that showed what an impact it had on the Soviet food situation. You had shortages of Soviet food in 40 because of the stuff they were sending to the Germans. Okay, in answer to your question though, why doesn't Germany just fall after it loses its Soviet lifeline? Well, it kind of does. And the other thing though is it took a lot of the Soviet Union. Remember that? It took 40% of the Soviet Union's grain production areas. It took most of its manganese. It didn't take the oil. It briefly took Maikop in the northern portion of the Caucasus, but it didn't get to the oil resources of the Caspian Basin. What the Germans had to do is make gasoline out of coal. And it was very expensive, very, very difficult, and they had a shortage of gasoline throughout the whole war as a result. The only other main source, they had some stuff in Thuringia, and they had some sources in Hungary and a few, I guess, in Poland, but most of their stuff came from Romania. And by the end of the war, the Americans and British had cottoned on to that and started hitting the fuel supplies. And by the end of the war, the Germans, they couldn't fly aircraft. They couldn't maneuver because they were short of all these things. What they also did in terms of food, which was also a critical thing, why didn't they starve? They didn't. The Dutch did. The French did. They took food from everybody else in Europe. Hitler said, before a single German starves, every European will die. And he meant it. But the answer is, they didn't win. And the reason they didn't win is because they didn't have the stuff to do it with. Does that answer your question?
You want to take maybe one more?
Any more? Alec. Oh, well, I keep talking to her.
Through the process of all the research and writing for this, has your opinion of any particular scholar kind of undergone any really kind of striking reappraisal?
This is live streamed. This is live streamed. I take back everything I said. Stephen Kotkin was here he's a nice guy. He was here as a Baker participant, and I just don't agree with some of his views on Stalin. Have my views under?
I'm assuming maybe this might not be the most appropriate example, but say as you started this project, maybe you would have recommended one biography of Stalin, and now you're a little bit
Oh, I see.
of something else. I mean, has your view, is there a scholar that you can think of and think, I appreciate his or her work more because of what I've learned, that he or she's onto something maybe? Anybody like that?
Well, one thing that I will say, I read all the Soviet military memoirs that came out during the Khrushchev years, and I thought, what can you believe, right? It was written under a regime of censorship. When I went back and read them, having read the actual Soviet documents, they're filled with interesting stuff. Once you know the story, because they tell you the human connections, and they're actually quite rich, and they don't really lie all that much. What they do is they eliminate bits that are inconvenient. But if you read the rest of it, it's solid gold. Zhukov's memoirs, Konyev's memoirs, Rokossovsky, these things are very, very, very good. Meretskov. So I was surprised by that. That's not really an answer to your question. An answer to your question would be there is a historian X who does Soviet foreign affairs, who I'm not going to name because this is being recorded, and I don't want to say something slanderous. But he has utterly misstated some documents to the point that they say 180 degrees the opposite of what they actually say. I once, when I was doing this early on, and it shows you how long I've been at this, like I say, don't study Soviet history. It doesn't help you. But I went to Norm Goda, and I presented him with the account in the book, and I presented him with the document, and said, what do you think? And he said, this guy's lying. And he was lying about that smoking gun that I told you about, Dimitrov's diary, and the explanation for the Nazi-Soviet pact. This guy had staked his entire career on a rather different view of the Nazi-Soviet period of cooperation. And so when the truth came out, he lied about it. There are others, and I don't really, over coffee, we'll talk about it. Catherine, you asked a question since you're the chair of the department and a good friend. And since you read the damn book.
I was going to say, you were answering Caitlin's question about dumping, women unprepared into the military. Also dumping women into industry unprepared. And so I am making a connection here. I think this women filling up the cells of the Gulag because they have come to work late or they take off a day. So there was no preparation, am I right, for wives and mothers' duties in the home to be filled in this workers' paradise if you send them all into industry. And they were probably having these problems in the workplace because they had to go home and feed kids or take care of elderly parents.
Absolutely. The Soviet Union had virtually no birth control before and during the Second World War. The Soviet Union had no sources domestically of rubber, and the Soviet government invested nothing in buying it. Although they did supply rubber to the Nazis, what they did is they bought it from the British and the Dutch in the East Indies, transshipped it. So the Germans would have tires for the aircraft that bombed London. But they didn't have enough for prophylactics. They didn't have birth control devices, and in 1936 they made abortion illegal. The birth rate, I got this out of a document from the Holocaust Museum. The Holocaust Museum has the best records on the Soviet Union. It has all the Ukrainian state records for the entire Second World War. I got the birth rates for 1939 and 1945. The birth rate in the Soviet Union in 1939 was equivalent to Benin currently, which is the 19th highest birth rate in the world presently. It's about 8.5 kids per mother. That was the average in Russia and in Ukraine. And they didn't have abortion, they didn't have birth control. And this business of, they had creches at every factory, rubbish. They didn't. They had no child care, they had no elder care, they had no invalid care, and women had these burdens of taking care of kids. Well, they weren't willing to leave the home because they had to take care of their families. So what Stalin did is or the Soviets did, I don't know if Stalin personally did it, established rationing standards that said if you're not in war work, you're not even going to have enough to feed your family. And the weapon of starvation drove them into the army. But there are these heartbreaking things, which I cite in a book that I've written, where women, and the NKVD are feeling sorry about this. They're saying, these poor women, they have to take care of their families. One woman missed a day of work. She had an elderly parent who was dying. She stayed home, and now she's being arrested. Her husband's at the front, her son's at the front, and she's going to have a term of 5 years in the Gulag. It's utterly heartbreaking. The madness of so much of Soviet life is just beyond belief. There was some shooting by ethnic Germans of retreating Soviet soldiers in 1941. So Stalin, in his rage, orders the deportation of 1.2 million ethnic Germans. And you have people living ghastly lives out in Siberia, productive farmers, scientists, technicians. They're taken out and dumped in Siberia, where half of them die. And the conditions are unbelievable. There's one, and I don't mean to gross you out, but there's one case where a woman, they said she and her family was entirely naked. I assume it means in rags. And they said they lacked shoes. They couldn't go out and dig a grave when one of the children died. And they asked the collective farm chairman to do it, and he couldn't do it, and the rat ate the kid's legs off. And this because some people shot at Soviet soldiers and Stalin was in a rage. This is what a dictatorship is. On that happy note. Any questions?